We're really pleased to have a great presentation tonight. I'm really thrilled at the turnout. I want to tell you a little bit first about what we're doing in the Press Club. Books and authors has been a really important part of the National Press Club agenda, and we feature top authors. After tonight, we have on Wednesday Mr. Tobin, who is, I'm sorry, he has just written The Oath, the Obama White House, and the Supreme Court. That's on Wednesday evening. On October 10th, we have the President of Colombia, who is going to be here working on trade policies. And on November 13th, we have our famous Book and Authors Evening, where we have about 100 authors signing their books, and it's great for buying holiday presents. It's a great festival of authors here, and you get a chance to really talk to the authors and buy the books. So welcome, and very happy to be a member of this committee that has been really forward-thinking part of the Press Club. Okay. The National Press Club's core values uphold the highest standards of journalism. It's really important as we navigate a new period of time, a new era, when we're really entering uncharted courses. We live in a state of change, but the Press Club supports the highest standards of journalism. Our Books and Authors Committee support the nonprofit National Press Club Journalism Institute, which trains communications professionals in this changing media environment, provides scholarships for the next generation of journalists, recognizes excellence in journalism, and houses the record of the history of journalism in the National Capitol, and promotes free press. Tonight's discussion is really, really important because just in the last few weeks there have been some major developments on diversity in the media. Last week, the National Hispanic Media Coalition released its Kellogg Foundation-supported study that found that negative media portrayals and conservative talk shows chatters are fueling potent stereotypes about immigrants and Latinos. And this is very often a lot of people's introduction to the Hispanic community in the United States. The results can be devastating. The NAACP has entered into 2 agreements with the National Hispanic Media Coalition and the National Hispanic Foundation on the Arts to push for more representation and better inclusion of people of color in all aspects, jobs and coverage. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting last month announced a $1.5 million grant to the National Public Radio to begin a major initiative on diversity in the media and to prepare journalists for both broadcast and digital media. So tonight's discourse is really, really timely and important, and we're happy to have you with us. Juan González of the New York Daily News and Democracy News and Joseph Torres will discuss News for All People, the epic story of race and the American media. A book signing will follow. And the way it is, they will speak for about 30 minutes, we'll have a Q&A, and then we'll have a book signing. News for All the People illuminates how Black, Latino, Asian, and Native American journalists fought to create a vibrant yet little-known alternative in democratic press and forced open the doors of major media companies. The initial research was begun with a Ford Foundation grant. News for All People has made the New York Times bestseller list and is a sweeping account of class and racial conflict in American news media, from the colonial newspaper to the internet age. It chronicles key government decisions that created our nation's system of news, major political battles over the role of the press, and the rise of media conglomerates and epoch-defining technology. The book reveals how racial segregation in the media distorted the news and unearths numerous examples of how publishers and broadcasters actually fomented racial violence through their coverage. Juan González, who I know because I'm a New Yorker and he's a courageous journalist for the Daily News, is a 2-time winner of the George Polk Award for Commentary in 1998 and 2010, and co-host of Democracy Now! He's a former president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and was inducted into the NHJ Hall of Fame. Under his leadership, NHJ created the Parity Project to assist news organizations in hiring and retaining Hispanic journalists and improving coverage of the Hispanic communities across the United States. His book, Harvest of the Empire, traces the history of immigration from different countries and has been made into a really exciting documentary, which he will talk about because it's being released this week in 2 cities. Joseph Torres is the Senior External Affairs Director of Free Press. Free Press is a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to reform media and telecom policies. With offices in Massachusetts and Washington, Free Press has a network of 500,000 activist members. He works to ensure that our nation's media policies serve the public interest and builds coalitions to broaden the media reform movement's base. Joseph writes frequently on the media, topics, and the internet. He's on the board of the Center for Media Justice. Excuse me. Great. Sorry. And what other board? Sorry.
Latino Filmmakers National Association.
I apologize. I apologize. Okay. And I want to make a special thanks tonight as they begin to the NHJ, and I think Ana Lopez Buck is here, and the Hispanic Link for their support of this evening's event. Thank you so much.
Good evening, and thanks to all of you for coming. I want to tell you why Joe and I decided to write this book and what we tried to do with it, what we learned in this 8-year process that it took us to finish the research and the writing of the book. I've been a professional journalist now for 35 years, the last 25 as a columnist at the New York Daily News. And I've been enormously frustrated over those years with the inability of our press to provide the American people the kind of information that they need to act as citizens. And to some degree, I've, over the years, felt a good degree of guilt for my participation in a process that falls way short of what many of us expected when we came out of school and entered the journalism profession. So I've always been questioning why we have so much media and so little knowledge among the American people. You know, we have 1,400 daily newspapers in the United States. We have about 1,200 television stations, 12,000 radio stations, News at 5, News at 6, News at 10, News at 11, all these cable news channels, all news sports channels, all news business channels, and yet there is so little knowledge among the people from all of this that they get, including their ability to download news sites on any contraption that the technology mavens can think of to put in our hands. At the same time, I've had the opportunity for the last 16 years to work in a completely different form of media than the commercial press. I've been the co-host with Amy Goodman of Democracy Now!, an alternative news program since it began 16 years ago, which is part of another great tradition in the American press that we don't pay as much attention to as we do the commercial press. Talking about the tradition of the working men's press of the 1830s, of the muckrakers of the late 19th century, of the New Left press of the 1970s, and of the progressive bloggers of our time. A completely different stream of the American press that has played its own dissident role vis-a-vis the commercial press. And I've also been lucky as a as a Puerto Rican, born in Puerto Rico, raised in the United States, but being able to speak Spanish and read Spanish throughout all this time. I've also been a participant in another great stream of the American press that gets even less attention. In the 1980s, I helped develop one of the first Spanish language weekly newspapers in Philadelphia, Enfoque Comunal, that lasted for about 30 years. I've participated in various other Latino press efforts over the years. So I've been lucky in one way to have worked in what I consider the three prongs of the press in America: the commercial and corporate press, the alternative and the dissident press, and what is commonly called as the ethnic or minority press. And one of the things that's always amazed me is how all of these are part of the press in America, yet they operate almost independently and sometimes oblivious to each other's existence or to their own separate roles in creating the press in America as we know it. And one of the things that's always amazed me is that there's enormous frustration among all the American people about their dissatisfaction with the press. But among people of color, they feel assaulted on an almost daily basis by the press, especially the commercial press, sometimes the alternative and the dissident press as well. They feel maligned, they feel marginalized, they feel that their hopes and dreams, their aspirations, their positive contributions to society are not recognized. So there is a burning anger, especially among African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans and Asian Americans, about how they're portrayed in the dominant or commercial press. So Joe and I figured about 8, 9 years ago that we needed to get to the bottom of this problem. Why did we have so much press and so little knowledge? Why was there so much effort to try to present news to the American people, yet so much distortion perceived by those who receive the news? And so we decided to try to go back to the beginning. And this book is really sort of the chronicle of what we attempted to do. And it is really two stories. It is the story, as Eileen mentioned, of how journalists of color and communities of color have attempted to have their story told more comprehensively and fairly. But it's also the story of how was the media in America constructed? How was the system of news in our nation constructed? Because those of us who work as journalists rarely think of it as a system, as an institution in the society. We go about trying to do our job and please our editors and get promoted or get the best story or get it first before anybody else. And we never stop to ask, what is the institution in which we work doing in the American society? And what can we do to make it better? So we tried to go at understanding the construction of the system. And we learned a few things, and I think we detail it pretty comprehensively in the book. First of all, we learned that the press in America was never a result of a free market system. But in fact, government policies have played a critical role in the development of the news system that we have in America. And unless we as journalists or we as citizens understand the construction of the system, we won't be able to understand how to reform or improve it. And we detail the key policy debates throughout American history, beginning way back with the founding fathers on the construction of our media system. The other thing we discovered is that technology has always played a revolutionary role. Mass communications technology has played a revolutionary role at key stages in the development of the American media system because every new advance in communication technology has subverted the existing order of this system of news that existed at that time, forced a rethinking of how do we spread news and information in the democracy, and necessitated the government coming in and establishing new rules of the road. And so technology has played a critical role in the system, in our system of news, and government policies in response to that technology have all sort of marked the stages of our system's development. And finally, the third key lesson that we learned is that race and racial coverage has not been a marginal side issue of the American news media. It hasn't been, you know, I always talk about, well, here's news and then here's racial coverage and here's diversity over here on the side. No, but race has been central to how the news has been carried out throughout American history. And we go back to the first newspaper in America, Public Occurrences, Boston, 1690. Benjamin Harris, Anabaptist publisher, produces the first newspaper in America, Public Occurrences, a 3-page sheet. And when we look at that first newspaper in America, we discovered that the bulk of the articles in that newspaper, 5 separate articles in 3 pages, was intelligence to the settlers about what the barbarians, the savages in the neighborhood of the Boston were up to. And it was an intelligence sheet to the settlers to help them maintain control and domination over the native populations that the Massachusetts colony had settled amongst. And of the 5 articles, only 1 could be said to have been positive in content. It was an article about how a group of Indians in Plymouth had Christianized Indians, was celebrating Thanksgiving, but all the other 4 articles were all about the threat that the natives posed. And throughout the colonial period, as we read the various newspapers, we saw that a huge percentage of the coverage of colonial newspapers was either about Native Americans or was about Africans, either slave revolts, violence of individual slaves against their masters, threats of free blacks in the northern cities in Boston and New York to the public tranquility. This was a key subject matter of the content of early colonial newspapers. So that's why it's important to trace the history so that we don't get caught up, well, it's this individual boss or it's this individual company that's doing this or it's not doing that or this one's a little better than that. We tried to look at it as a system of news, as an institution throughout American society. What's been its role? So those are the 3 things I think that we concentrated on: the construction of the media system itself, the role of technology in government's response and the people's response to technology in mass dissemination of news, and the role that race has played throughout American history, and we take it up to throughout the country's history, the rise of the Associated Press, and what we call the Associated Press, which brought about the mass production of racial bigotry throughout American society. Until then, it was individual racial bigotry in different cities. But the Associated Press turned it into an entire national movement, and we document how that happened and the role of the Associated Press and the wire services in that. But I'm just going to quickly talk about the technology, and Joe's going to talk a little bit about the individual battles of people of color and the press to try to change things, especially in the period of radio, television, and the internet. There have been basically 5 great technological revolutions in the press in America. The first was the first internet, which was the post office. The post office was our first internet. In 1792, the Founding Fathers got together, tried to figure out how they were going to hold these new colonies, now states, together. And they decided that the dissemination of knowledge was key to maintaining the citizenry feeling as one nation. So a great debate arises in Congress in 1792, since the main job of the postal system as it began to develop was not to deliver letters, it was to deliver newspapers. Throughout the 19th century, 90% of the traffic of the United States postal system was not private letters, it was newspapers and magazines. 90%. Right, the main job of the post office was to deliver newspapers to the American people. Because in those days, you couldn't buy them on the street corner. You were scattered in farms all over the place. Somebody had to bring them to you, and it was the postal system and the postal roads that Congress developed that brought them there. Big debates arise in Congress with Washington and Franklin, and on one side saying the government should deliver newspapers for free. Madison and some of the other free marketeers saying, no, they should deliver them at the cost of whatever it costs to deliver a newspaper versus a letter. As often happens in the United States, a compromise is reached. They created a second-class postal system. Subsidized delivery of newspapers to the American people by the government, because the spread of knowledge was so important to maintaining the new republic. That was the first key decision that was made. It gave rise to a huge number of newspapers in America, throughout the United States, local newspapers, battles every year in Congress over postal subsidies, preference given to local newspapers versus national newspapers, all kinds of debates. There were debates over communications policy in America. The next great battle that develops is over the development of the telegraph. Instant communications now. Will the government own the telegraph in the same way that it owned the postal system? Decision went the other way. Let the private market run the telegraph. The result was, by the 1860s, all the various telegraph companies in America had been bought up by one company, Western Union, the first industrial monopoly in America. Western Union creates an alliance with the Associated Press, and they create a cartel, an information cartel, to basically centralize the dissemination of news throughout American life and society to all those newspapers that depended on AP wire coming out of those newspapers in New York that decided what was the news that the country would receive in the daily dispatch of the AP. Next big communications technology, radio. Television was an extension of radio. The same networks that controlled radio controlled television. Then comes cable, and finally the internet. Those are the 5 great technological revolutions, for which each time they happened, they destabilized the previous existing order of news. The government had to step in and devise new rules of operation for information spread in America. Every time one of these key policy decisions occurs, there's a huge battle between citizen groups, owners of the old media, owners of the new media, civic-minded folks, educational reformers. And these battles go on usually with the old media trying to keep the public out of knowing what's going on. And especially the journalists who work in this. They don't want the journalists to have any say in these weighty matters of media policy. But they are critical to what kind of news and information the people will receive. So that's what we document in the book. We also document this constant democratic thrust of people of color to have their stories told properly. And what we try to do in many instances, for instance, those of you here in Washington, you'll love to see the section about the 1941 Civil Rights March that A. Philip Randolph tried to organize, the first great civil rights march in Washington, and the role of the Washington Post in spreading all kinds of news articles in the months leading up to that march about a black crime wave in the city of Washington, meant to assist President Roosevelt in preventing the Civil Rights March from happening. Or the LA Times' role in the Zoot Suit riots of 1943, or the Chicago Tribune's role in the 1919 race riot in Chicago. We document what they wrote. We document what the local black or Latino newspapers wrote. We show you the gap in the representation of what was actually happening in those instances. And of course, we talk about, and I'll leave this one because it's always my favorite, we talk about the Wilmington race riot of 1898, one of the truly lurid scandals of American journalism, which has yet to be fully exposed. In November of 1898, the city of Wilmington had a majority black city council. It was one of the last Reconstruction governments still in operation in the South. And right after the November election, a group of 2,000 armed whites marched into Wilmington, rounded up all of the elected black officials of the town of Wilmington at gunpoint, put them on a train, ordered them out of town. Before that, they burned down the local black newspaper, a daily, the Wilmington Record of Alexander Manley, a daily newspaper. They then proceeded to shoot up the town. Dozens of African Americans were killed, hundreds fled. And they appointed a former Confederate officer as the new mayor of Wilmington. In November of 1898, there was an armed coup in Wilmington, North Carolina. The organizer and the leader of the coup was a man by the name of Josephus Daniels. Josephus Daniels was the editor and publisher of the Raleigh Observer. He was one of the most noted Southern editors of his time. He was the father of Jonathan Daniels, who in the 1950s became one of the New South integrationist editors. But in 1898, Josephus Daniels was a populist, and he boasts in his biography, in his autobiography, of meeting at night in the newspaper offices of in his town with the various other members of the White League, plotting the kind of coverage they would put into the newspaper to whip up the white community in preparation for the coup. And he was celebrated afterwards as the mastermind and the leader of the coup. Josephus Daniels was no minor figure. He was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson. He later, when Wilson is elected president, was named Secretary of the Navy. He was our Secretary of the Navy during World War I. As Secretary of the Navy, he was a mentor to a young undersecretary named F. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When Roosevelt is elected president, he names Josephus Daniels U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. He was a major political figure in the early 20th century of the United States. He was also a racist, a murderer, a man who boasted of burning down a black newspaper in his own town. You read the journalism histories, when they mention him, they always mention him as a populist who fought against the Duke Empire and the railroads. They never talk about his role in the Wilmington coup of 1898. A few years ago in Wilmington, they appointed a racial commission that examined the happenings in Wilmington in 1898. The commission basically laid out, you can get it on the internet, the Wilmington Race Commission report on the 1898 troubles. They laid out the role of all the newspapers in North Carolina in helping to foment the racial violence. And every one of the major papers in North Carolina has since apologized publicly to their readers for their paper's role. Now, this is all great, but it came 100 years after the coup. And no one was ever held responsible. No one was ever jailed. The military never went into Wilmington to reestablish the democratically elected leadership of Wilmington. Compensation was never paid to the African-American families that were killed and driven out of the city. And so like that, there are many examples that we provide in the book where the press not only misrepresented and distorted the news, but actually played a role participating in fomenting racial pogroms. The Rocky Mountain News and the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, the Tucson Citizen, and several other Arizona newspapers in the Camp Grant Massacre against Apaches in 1874. We list one after another examples. The Southern television and radio stations that fomented riots against the desegregation of the University of Mississippi in 1962. And we list all this so that people can see the history. Somebody has to see the history of the press, not only guardians of free expression, but also fomenters and instigators of some of the worst examples of racial bigotry in our country's history. And we cannot reform the press until we understand its role, and that's what we've tried to do in this book. And Joel, talk a little bit about how, especially with radio and television and the internet, the battle has continued.
You know, to pick it up where Juan left it, one of the things that that was pretty amazing about the early history of our country, if the development of the post office, which is still critical today, is that when Juan talked about the subsidizing of newspapers that helped to build the newspaper industry, one of the things it did allow to happen was the creation of our nation's first ethnic newspapers. 1827, the first African-American newspaper in the country is Freedom's Journal. In 1808, Spanish language paper in Mississippi, New Orleans. 1828, the Cherokee Phoenix. Before the Civil War, there were about 100 ethnic newspapers in this country. About 30 African-American newspapers, around 80 Spanish language newspapers. And the reason they existed was because government policy was a decentralized media system that created a newspaper industry and allowed people of color to be able to speak with their own voice. And we've been fighting for this ever since. My favorite quote, I always love to start off when I speak with this quote, because it's still so relevant today, is the first African-American newspaper in this country was Freedom's Journal, founded in 1827 in New York City, in Lower Manhattan. They organized in Lower Manhattan to actually, that resulted in the creation of this paper to deal with the racist news coverage that was going on in New York City at the time. And the publishers of the paper simply said, the reason why they founded the paper is that we wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. From the press and the pulpit, we have suffered much by being incorrectly represented. That is still true today. It is, when we first started off working on this project years ago, these kind of things I didn't know much about. And it is inspiring to see there's been people who have been fighting for a just media system for close to 200 years. But it's also tragic that that quote is as relevant today as it was back then. I was at a press conference with Eileen last week where there was a survey about people's attitudes, non-Latinos' attitudes about Latinos, and they're saying when they're watching what they see in the media portrayal, non-Latinos, they're more likely to see a Latino committing crime, 8 to 9 times more likely to see a Latino committing crime on television than being a doctor. There was a study by Pew last year of the Pittsburgh media market, and the most dominant image of black males continue to be crime. And the reason is because we're unable to plead our own cause. Other people tell our stories. We own very few daily newspapers, radio stations, TV stations. So with that, I want to connect it to the radio. So we're able to create this ethnic newspaper, and it's critically important in helping to provide news and information to people of color at a time when there's tremendous discrimination. And the thing is, the lesson is people of color have embraced the media from the very get-go, and radio was no different. When early radio was formed, it's not what we think about it today, commercial radio. For the first 20 or 30 years of radio, when it was first created, really amateurs helped to develop radio. Amateur radio, anyone could get really an amateur radio license, and thousands of people were getting amateur radio license, including people of color. We document in the book and doing our research, and it was really surprising to us. 1915, 1916, in places like Chicago, the Woodland Radio Association, a amateur radio club for African Americans were getting together to teach each other how to broadcast. In Baltimore, the Banneker Radio Club in the early 1920s, same thing, a guy named Roland Carrington was organized the community to get involved in radio. In 1915 or 16, we have a guy named John C. Rodriguez in San Antonio, who had an amateur radio license. In 1922. He becomes he starts the second commercial station in San Antonio, Latino, right? This is before the FCC, the Federal Radio Commission, the government stepped in and started regulating radio for the first time. People of color were embracing radio for the first time. But unlike newspapers, radio is a different issue. You have scarcity issues. You have only a certain amount of spectrum, and you have all amateurs, too many amateurs were getting on the airways were being polluted with a lot of different amateur radio operators and commercial operators were coming aboard, and it was chaos in the air. So the Federal Radio Commission decides, the Congress passes a law that gives the government, for the first time, the ability to regulate radio for the first time. It's called the Federal Radio Commission was created in 1927. So what does the Federal Radio Commission do? It has a choice. It can either create a decentralized radio system or a centralized radio system. What it does, it turns over control. It gives some of the most powerful, many of the most powerful stations, most of the most powerful stations, to NBC and CBS. Not a person of color or a woman received a radio license. And why this is important, because corporations like NBC and CBS and white males received the first radio licenses. They use those stations to build wealth, to become the first television station owner, and the next cable station network owner. So they used the wealth of a free radio license to help grab a dominant hold in the media. But what happens? The Federal Radio Commission was created in 1927, and let me show you this picture here. One of the first stations, commercial stations, to get a license was right here in Washington, D.C. That is from the Washington Post in 1927. It was a station. It was a station that was run by a newspaper called the Fellowship Forum. The Fellowship Forum was a Klan newspaper. It was owned by the Klan. And there you go, the Washington Post. That station is sold to CBS. It's eventually owned by the Washington Post. And right now, WTOP, that's its origins. The WTOP was founded as a Klan station, right? So Juan talked about what happens when media is centralized. What happens when you are unable to tell your own stories and other people tell your stories? It causes great harm. They often get it wrong, right? And so what happens, the most popular radio program in the country in the early 1930s was Amos and Andy. Black-faced minstrel show, buffoonery, and mocking black intelligence. And this is what Amos and Andy looked like. It was on the NBC network, right? 40 million people a night were listening to Amos and Andy, half the nation's radio listening audience, right? Robert Mann, now, he was the publisher of the Pittsburgh Courier. The black newspapers have always played a critical role in our society. But during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, they were extremely powerful. They had huge circulation. So Robert Mann decides that he's going to launch a campaign in 1931 to get Amos and Andy off the air, right? And he believes in his paper, he writes in his paper, if we only collect enough petitions, we're going to, our lawyers tell us if we go to the Federal Radio Commission, they have to deal with this problem of Amos and Andy. They published pages in this broadsheet, letters to the editor, there's pages and the pages of it, of people expressing their concern and outrage about Amos and Andy. That people were literally, one letter said, this person said that my boss is being asked, are you more like Amos or are you more like Andy? And that's how they were comparing black folk. It was like you were being compared to a stereotype, and it is extremely damaging. So Robert Mann organized this petition drive in 1931 to get 720,000 people to cut out the petition from his newspaper and send it in, right? The Federal Radio Commission didn't even pay it any mind. It just ignored it. So there's Robert Mann. This is what Amos and Andy looked like. Robert Mann. 20 years after the Federal Radio Act is passed in 1927, 20 years, the first person of color to own a broadcast station, a commercial station, as Raul Cortez in 1946. Jesse Blayton becomes the first African-American radio station owner in Atlanta. What happens is a white racial narrative develops, like it developed in newspapers, it developed in commercial radio. So Juan talked about Southern broadcasters. We document in here, like Juan was saying, what happened at the University of Mississippi. But Southern broadcasters very much after the Brown versus Board of Education decision wanted to maintain a segregated society. So white citizens councils were being formed all over the South, right? And they were creating public affairs programming that literally were airing on Southern broadcast stations. And one of those stations that was airing these public affairs programs was WLBT in Jackson, Mississippi, in 1966. Now, during this time, African-American leaders and the United Church of Christ, this is Reverend Everett C. Park, United Church of Christ, decided to challenge the license of WLBT, but at the time, no U.S. citizen could challenge a broadcast license. Even though the public owned the airwaves, you were not allowed to file a license challenge. So he worked with African-American leaders in Jackson, Mississippi. They brought a license challenge, and a federal court decided in 1966 that U.S. citizens did have a legal right for the first time in our nation's history to actually challenge a license. Now, this is important because since then, right, it's been a few media reform movements. The media reform movements in the 1970s and currently. During the early 1970s, more than 340 license challenges were brought by Black and Brown Latino leaders. It resulted in democratizing our media system. So what would happen, a license was up for renewal every 3 years, and black and brown leaders would bring these license challenges, and as a result, they will have a citizens agreement where broadcasters agree to increase programming and to hire people of color as a result. So I'm going to skip to the end. Like Juan was saying, whenever a technology comes along, right, it fundamentally changes the media system. And during the late 1970s, there was people of color fighting to make sure that cable system was going to also represent the interest of people of color. But this is William Wright from Black Efforts in Soul and Television. He writes here, the potential of cable television is beyond imagination. With the increased number of channels possible for cable TV, we should make certain that some of these channels are set aside for us. It's fantastic what we will be able to do with them. We could begin to communicate with each other, something desperately needed that we need to do. This is really our big chance, and if we blow this one, we might as well forget it. So here it is, cable, the chance for people of color to actually have own cable networks. And once again, it's centralized control. We have, there's no person of color that we know of today that actually owns a broadcast, a cable network. So let me just skip to the end. So the internet, right? The internet is the greatest decentralized communication network that we have to date, right? Anyone who gets online can go visit any website that you can at any speed. So if you have a website, I can get to your site just as fast as I can get to CNN or the Washington Post. But the future, the internet is at risk today. Big cable companies like Verizon and AT&T and Comcast, they want to create a two-tier system in which if I want to go to your site, you're going to have to pay the cable companies more money to make sure that the public can visit your site at the fastest speeds. And if you can't pay that money, the site will be slowed down. And this is critically important because people of color, the internet is the lowest barrier of entry for us to be able to have our own media presence. So this is Verizon, right? Verizon recently said this, broadband providers possess editorial discretion, just as newspapers are entitled to decide what content to publish and where broadband providers may feature some content over others. This is what the mindset of the cable companies are right now when it comes to the internet. They believe they have the editorial discretion to pick winners and losers online. And for people of color, this is the lowest barrier of entry for us to have a voice. And the broadband providers, once again, centralized control of the media. Once again, this history continues to repeat itself. So I'm gonna leave it right there. Sorry, it's a little scattered in my presentation here. I should not went with the PowerPoint, but I'd be happy to answer any questions Juan.
Before we open for questions, before we open for questions, we do have one of the pioneer media people here for the Hispanic Link, Charlie Erickson, who formed his own news service. I report for the Hispanic Link, and it's one of the brave people who have taken on getting Hispanic news out. We'll now have a Q&A and Juan and Joe will be will select the questions. Okay.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Herman. I do freelance for a media group in Jakarta. Can you explain about what the whole explanation is about how the press in the past has the capability to build a nation? How do you explain the press and journalism, which is too decentralized, too personalized, that makes sometimes terrible, like what happened in Libya? Thank you.
I had a little trouble hearing you. You said how the press, what?
how the present decentralized media, like the internet, so many things happen, and everybody can do his own medium, everything. So how do you explain the role of the present media to build nation building?
Try that. So what's Juan saying, throughout our history, government plays a critical role in deciding the shape of our media industry. And these decisions, the shape of our media, the media we have today, there's nothing organic about it. You know, as Juan described, from whether it's newspapers or TV, there is always a debate about who should, how the media should look like, who should own it. And too often, what I failed to mention in my presentation is that the citizens are not engaged in this discussion. The citizens are not informed. And we have an example, for example, big companies are always at the table deciding in lobbying. We have an example, it's a funny story in the book where Frank Gannett, right, Gannett, in 1927, he writes a letter to the President of the United States, basically, saying that in Albany, I want to get I'm not even interested in radio. I have no idea what radio is about, but I can't let Hearst get this newspaper in Albany. Can you make certain I get the station? Now, the letter he writes to the Federal Radio Commission doesn't say any of that. He says it will be in the public interest for me to get a broadcast license. I have a news department, right? And I will be better able to serve. This is the way our media system has always worked. There is a public facing to how this is going to benefit society, and then there is the lobbying going on behind the scenes. We look at today the future of the internet, and I hope I'm answering your question. The future of the internet, close to $100 million is spent each year by telecom companies and their associations on lobbying the government to make sure it gets policies that benefit its corporate ambition. The reason journalists need to get involved in these issues is because your bosses, the folks you work for, are lobbying the FCC and Congress. They're lobbying them, telling them what is best for journalism. They're saying if you allow us to get bigger and consolidate more, it's going to save jobs. It's going to actually be better for the quality of journalism. So this is the role that the U.S. media has played in shaping not only our society, and seeing the kind of news we're seeing. Did I answer your question? Okay. I hope I did.
Thanks.
Well, if I understand your question, I think that why it's important to maintain a decentralized media system is that, first of all, we've seen how early on in the country's history, through the postal policy, a decentralized system did allow diverse voices to be heard. Increasingly, as our system in the mid to late 20th century, beginning actually with as I mentioned, AP Western Union monopoly, but then that was broken up by the decentralization of radio, re-centralized under TV, and decentralized again under cable. But again, there were many cable companies originally. Two now control about 50% of the market, Comcast and Time Warner. So there's been a battle over centralization and decentralization in American society of the media system back and forth. Our analysis is that when the media is more decentralized, people of color have a greater opportunity to own, their own media companies and to be heard and to contend with the dominant narrative. The more you centralize the system, the fewer voices, the voices that are going to control the news dissemination are going to be the richest and most powerful. The more you decentralize the system, the more you allow it more democratic voices to be heard. So our analysis is people of color have always benefited when the system has been more decentralized. And that's why we argue for a decentralized media system, and we want to keep the internet as decentralized as possible and not allow some groups or some companies to exercise their editorial discretion. What editorial discretion? You're a conveyor of internet content, of internet traffic. You're not now going to make it into, you're a publisher. Comcast is not a publisher. You know, if they want to do that, then we should turn the internet providers into utilities and let everyone have equal say in terms of the content that is put out over it.
Yeah. Excuse me, I have a comment and a sort of a question. When I was a young lad about 100 years ago, our history books were really full of propaganda. We were the good guys and the Indians were the the bad guys. And I was very delighted to see, we've got grandkids that are 10 years old, that see that they tell stories about the abuse heaped on the Indians by the colonists. So that's kind of turned around. Would you care to comment on that aspect of our history?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been an ongoing battle. In fact, we have a whole chapter on the development of the native press, which to us was the most fascinating of all. That Native Americans developed their own press, starting with the Cherokee Phoenix in 1828, only a few years after the Cherokee had developed a written language. Right? Sequoyah developed an alphabet for the Cherokee Nation in the early 1820s. And within a few years, the entire Cherokee Nation had become literate in the language, and they developed their own newspaper published by Elias Boudinot, which for 8 years published every week, telling the story of the Native Americans for the first time in their own language in their newspaper until the Georgia militia destroyed their press. But once the Cherokee were removed to the Oklahoma territory, they began developing new newspapers, Cherokee Rosebud, Cherokee Advocate, the Shawnee Press developed. And the amazing thing that we found out is that Native Americans actually made the biggest inroads in the 19th century into the dominant Anglo press. The Sacramento Bee was not founded by James McClatchy. It was founded by John Rollins Ridge, a Cherokee Indian writer, who sold it to his employee, McClatchy, after a couple of years. But in the early years, the Sacramento Bee was a big advocate of the native population of California. And of course, the McClatchy history on its website never mentions that John Rollins Ridge was the founder of the paper, not James McClatchy. Likewise, the San Diego Union was founded by a Native American, Ned Bushyhead, who was a part owner and publisher of the San Diego Union. So Native Americans actually made some of the earliest inroads into the Anglo or dominant press. So we tried to trace all this history to show the richness, the attempt to tell a more complete story. And we actually, one of the interesting things is there was a study that was done in the 1930s of the press in Texas. And one of the things that this sociologist found was that the newspapers in Texas, obviously throughout the state, had incredibly negative percentage of portrayal of African Americans. But in those towns where African Americans could vote, were able to vote in municipal elections, the coverage in the local press was not nearly as bad as it was in places where they couldn't vote. Once African Americans began to have the right to vote, even in local elections, suddenly the image began to change in the existing press. so that you can see that the inroads that occur as people gain more and more influence and power changes the kind of perspective that is produced in the press of people of color. But it's an ongoing battle.
Oh, you were going to answer?
No, no.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Gloria Brown Marshall, and I'm a freelancer. I'm in New York, but I freelance for a number of radio stations with primarily people of color as listeners and for black newspapers. And I've researched for my own books and things the power of the black press during the 40s and 50s and 60s, and we've seen a change. They say, when, other people get a cold, people of color get pneumonia. So when it comes to the black press, I'm bracing for your answer. Where do you see it going in the future?
Well, there's been discussion about that, right? And I've seen articles really saying is the black press dead? And it's not dead. It obviously is a couple of hundred papers, I believe, more than 200, I think, black weeklies. I believe that's right. And I just think that it's facing the same kind of issues traditional media is facing, right? It's the migration of the loss of the advertising dollar, but also too, the black press, and Juan, I don't know how you feel about this, because we don't really address what's the state of the black press at this moment. Last chapter's on the internet, but when integration happened, a lot of great black journalists were integration of the newsroom. When the citizens movement started happening in the 1960s and 70s, that forced broadcasters to democratize to integrate their newsrooms. A lot of the folks who worked in the black press went to work for English language. The mainstream press, and so you had all that talent leave, right? Leaving the black newspapers, so I don't. It's definitely the future. I'm never going to say the future of the black press. I think is going to always remain, because there's going to be people who need news and information about for and about the black community. But as far as it in print, that's where we're struggling, right? The future of print. How do we save newsrooms, regardless of where the journalism is happening, online or in print?
Yes, sir.
Diane.
Thanks for a great presentation. I'm Diane Sines, and I'm a member of the Press Club. I've read quite a bit about how entertainment programming in the networks is extremely profitable, and much more so than news programming. So I'm wondering how, given that they're publicly held corporations, how that is affecting budgets for news gathering, especially among Spanish language networks. For example, Comcast, which is known as primarily an entertainment company, acquired NBC News, which acquired Telemundo. So how is that acquisition likely to affect Telemundo?
Well, in the book, we don't get too much into entertainment. We did a little bit in terms of Amos and Andy, and in terms of some other commercials, the Frito Bandido commercials in the 1960s that triggered a huge Chicano response. So we try to concentrate more on news and the impact on news. But in reference to the Telemundo situation, I have a particular story because I was directly involved. At the time, I was the president of actually NBC acquired Telemundo before Comcast acquired NBC. And NBC acquired Telemundo in early 2001. And I was president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists at the time. We had a concern as to what was NBC going to do with Telemundo. And I remember going to a meeting at Rockefeller Center with Jay Ireland, who was then the president of stations of NBC, and they wanted NAHJ not to raise criticisms to the FCC about their purchase of Telemundo. And Jay Ireland sat right across the desk from me and said, Juan, I guarantee you, NBC, we have all of these resources. We're going to pump up the news coverage of Telemundo. We're going to have Telemundo reporters on the reporting on the NBC staff. We're going to have all these resources that are going to improve news coverage of the Latino community. Within 2 or 3 years, NBC announced that they were building a regional hub in the West, in Fort Worth, was it? In Fort Worth. They were closing down the news operations of Telemundo, the local news in Telemundo in Denver, in San Jose, in Sacramento, in a half dozen major cities in the West. They were going to do all of the local news for all those cities out of their hub in Fort Worth and keep 1 or 2 reporters, one for sports and one for local news in the cities. They were essentially shutting down all the news, the 6 o'clock news operations in all these major cities. The exact opposite of what they had promised to the FCC and us when they offered to take over Telemundo. So this is the problem with media concentration. The news people always have great ideas, but it's the bean counters that run the stuff, right? It's the budget people that run the stuff. And when they see an opportunity to cut, right, and when they see a body that isn't producing revenue, as far as they can see, then they rule. So that's why you can't look at the promises. You have to look at the reality of what media consolidation has meant. And I believe it's all in the internet now because we've all merged basically. It's one platform with the video, voice, and print all together. And the big issue now is ownership. I continue to say it's ownership. I think Joe was telling me about a new study that showed that foundations have given $180 million to internet startup companies over the last few years. My question for the foundations is, how much of that money went to African American and Latino and Asian Americans and Native American internet startup companies, right? Answer that question for me, and you'll tell me where the internet is going. Because if you select the people that you want to succeed, then you've already made a big decision. And the question to me is, where's the diversity in that? Where's the diversity in the angel investor startup money for our new media system of the 21st century?
We talk about this in the book too. Often English language media companies treat their Spanish language property as just revenue sources. It always amazes me whether it's Telemundo or an English language daily that has a Spanish language weekly, how the English language paper has no idea what's going on in the Latino community, and all it has to do is open up the Spanish language paper to find out, and they don't do that. And one example, this Telemundo thing, so NBC, like you said, got bought by Comcast, and a part of his agreements, it is agreed to do 1,000 hours more of news per each local station. Originally, it had no such intent when it came to Telemundo. That same commitment wasn't there. My organization actually worked on this, and we got 5 stations. So there's 5 Telemundo stations that has a commitment of 1,000 hours. But they weren't even, there's like 21 or 22 Telemundo stations. They didn't even want to apply the same standard to the English language station, the commitment to news, as they did to the Spanish language station. And so it's just a revenue source too often is treated as a sorry stepchild.
All right, over here.
Casey, I'm studying journalism. Thanks. This question is for Joseph.
Yeah.
How significant is the recently launched broadcast network OWN and its place in reshaping perceptions of minority groups in America?
Well, it's just one network, right? So it's like, that's the thing, Comcast, back to Comcast. Comcast said it was going to, in his agreements, they're going to have 10 cable networks about people of color, right? How many hundred, we'll see. Robert Rodriguez got a cable network, right? But you look at OWN, right? It's like, is there any, excuse me? And it's also, isn't it Discovery too? But the thing is, what news are they producing, right? There's no news. If you're, if you're a person of color, if you're African American, where do you get your news from on television? Spanish language, there is, if you're a Spanish language speaker, at least you can go to the local Telemundo Univision station. So you have Puff Daddy and Magic Johnson getting networks. And I'm not saying there's no value in that, but when it comes to news and information, one last thing I'll say about this. We have an example, well, Robert Johnson. John Malone, this big cable mogul, invested in Robert Johnson about $500 million to start BET in 1980. And the reason he invested in Bob Johnson was, he said, because he's the kind of black man who won't cause any trouble. And so when you do get invested in, who are they invested in? Are they invested in folks who can really empower our community with news and information, or are they going to just do news and entertainment, or are they going to just do music videos and entertainment, kind of Kim Kardashian type of VH1 Basketball Wives kind of stuff,
Okay, last question back there, all the way in the back. No, yeah, you.
In the last year, as a result of the increased interest in the Hispanic vote, we've seen a lot of different media organizations launch Hispanic websites and increase their Hispanic coverage in English, in part because there are so many Hispanics who, in the second and third generations, who prefer to read their news in English. But the budgets for these organizations is extremely limited. So we're seeing this huge boom and this kind of appearance of an opportunity. But if you go and try and get work from these organizations, being a bilingual reporter, I do, the budgets just aren't there. So are you guys skeptical or hopeful about these new outlets that are opening up, and whether or not this is a new area of expansion, or is this just temporary?
Well, this has been going on for a while now. It's obviously because the Latino population of the United States continues to skyrocket. It's about 52, 53 million now. It's going to be 130 million by 2050. And if you follow the Census Bureau projections, you realize that by the end of this century, a majority of the people living in the United States could very well trace their origins not to Europe, but to Latin America. But so that the population continues to skyrocket, and the media companies continue to try to figure out how to make money off of it. And this is not a new phenomenon. The first Spanish language newspaper in the United States in 1808, that Joe mentioned in Mississippi, was an Anglo-owned newspaper. It was the second Spanish language newspaper, El Mensajero Luis Anés, in 1810, that was actually Latino-owned. The first Chinese language newspaper in America was owned by a Presbyterian missionary in San Francisco. So this is the foreign language press in America has always, there's always been people who wanted to reach the market and make money, and there's people who wanted to reach the people and tell news and tell information. We welcome anybody who wants to start press geared to people of color, because it provides more jobs for journalists. However, we are skeptical of what the true motives and social worth of those publications will be, because we believe ownership is the key question. Joe put up the figures, the 3%, 8%, then he forgot to tell you what it was.
So 3% is the number of television stations people of color own. 8% is the number of radio stations people of color are owned. And 6% is the number of broadcast properties overall that women own. And women, make up 51% of the population.
And when you get to daily newspapers, it's really abysmal. Even the Spanish language newspapers, the major Spanish language dailies in the United States, are no longer owned by Latinos. There's Diario Las Americas still in Miami, and a couple that are owned now by Latin American capital, but U.S. Latinos own virtually no Spanish language dailies in the United States. And yet the Latinos are 16, 17% of the population. So it's a real problem. Ownership is the key question. And now I'm not even concerned anymore about radio and TV, because it's all in the internet now. Who's going to own the news media sites on the internet? And will there be a proportional ownership by African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans and Asian Americans on the internet?
Juan,
That's the key question.
Can I just finish off with back what Juan is saying? So again, the open internet, an issue called net neutrality, internet freedom. And one of the things we mentioned in the book is that people of color have always fought for a decentralized media system. And one of our concerns today is, of course, the role of big money in the telecom in lobbying that. But another one of our concerns that we address in the book is the role of our own community in advocating for keeping the internet open and free and accessible. Too many of our brothers and sisters in the civil rights community are ideologically aligned with the big telecom companies on this issue, should an internet remain open and free too often. And we have challenged them respectfully in the book and in person that we have to continue to fight to make sure that we have a decentralized media system, the internet, because at the end of the day, this is about, as Juan said, ownership and us being able to tell our own story. When other people tell our stories, it causes harm. And so this is, we are hopeful that there's going to be, we're going to continue, we are hopeful that the fight for the internet is going to be a just one and that we can prevail, but there's no certainty in that.
Yeah, and as Joseph, we have to nudge the national civil rights groups a little bit, the NAACP, National Council of La Raza, LULAC, the others. They've gotten so used to getting these big donations from Verizon and Time Warner and cable, Comcast and the scholarships and the building funds and all this other stuff, that when these companies need them to sign a letter to the FCC, they don't even read them sometimes. They, oh yeah, so write it for us and we'll send it in. And this is what's happening, unfortunately. So they've got to go back to the spirit of Robert Vann and some of the early
Frederick
pioneers who stood up to the big companies and said, no, we got to have a better story told. So thank you very much.
Before we have the book signings, which will be at this table, I just want to remind you, September 9th, Jeffrey Tobin on Obama White House and the Supreme Court. November 13th, we have our book fair, and that's really an exciting event where we have authors sign and talk to you. And we have a closing ceremony. I would like to add one thing. There's been less money for investigative journalism, so to have a publication like this is critical, because without investigative journalism, it's really difficult to move forward. I'd like to have Joe Motherell come up with me. He's the head of our committee. He's been really great at getting this to fruition. And Joe and I have a way for you to sign up and also leave your business card so that we can stay in touch with everyone. So I will guard the list and the business card. We have a bowl. We also have a closing ceremony to thank these wonderful presenters and authors. Because of my recent experience going back to New York, I was going to say it's a mugging ceremony, but this is our treasured gift. It's our certificate of appreciation. It is the historic National Press Club mug, and I'd like Joe to help me with this. Oh, okay. Gentlemen, you have now been given the jewel.